Right, hello everyone. Let's get started. Might as well start a couple of minutes early. I'm just going to check everything is okay on the stream, and then we'll get into the questions. Excuse me. Let's make sure it's okay. Let's see how delayed this stream is. Okay. Right, perfect. Right, hello and welcome to the third in a series of live streams looking at A-level politics. I've got a cracking pair of questions today to look at. Okay, we're going to have a discussion first at Parliament and the role that Parliament plays and the functions of Parliament and whether or not they're any good. And then the second question, we're just going to be discussing the Labour Party, whether or not Labour Party represents new Labour or old Labour. We're going to get some, a bit of Labour drama coming up in this stream, and we'll see what's what. So, like always, we're going to discuss these two exam questions, and like usual, any extra reading or sources that I mention, that I will link them in the chat. So if I have any extra sources that you can use, then I'll link them down in the chat for you to refer to later. Okay, so the first of the questions is, to what extent do both houses of Parliament fail to carry out their main functions? Now, this is a nice question, I would argue. So really it's asking, the first thing you should be thinking when we have this question is, one, what are the functions of Parliament? Okay, and then the second question is, okay, well now I've listed these functions, I know what these functions are, to what extent do the Houses of Parliament carry out these functions? Are they any good, or do they fail at carrying out these functions? That's what we're going to look at here. So, what are the functions of both Houses of Parliament? Okay, so let's just, first question, so what are the functions of Parliament? What are the functions of Parliament? That's the first question we're going to examine. Just make sure everything's working perfectly. Everything is going well. We'll get more people in later. Beautiful. Right, I've got some sources as well that I'll link in due time, if they load. There we go. Oopsie daisy. There we go. Perfect. Perfect. So, what are the functions of Parliament? Well, the first function of Parliament, obviously, is to pass legislation. Now, you can definitely argue that Parliament is successful. You could definitely argue that Parliament is successful in the passing of legislations. So we can look at, for one way, we can look at the public bill statistics. So we can look at how many pieces of legislation have been passed in a certain period of time. I'm just getting up this one here. We got some information here. Let me find it. So we've got this link here for the first question. Which is the kind of a document about the amount of legislation that is passed between 2017 and 2019. I know we're in 2021, but sometimes it takes a lot of time to accumulate the kind of statistics. So that's public bill statistics. We can look at the volume of legislation, the number of acts have passed between the Parliament, these kind of things as well. We can look at all of these pieces of evidence to support the fact that we have the passing of legislation. Okay, that is the function of Parliament. However, you could make the counter argument, of course, that this has been a downward trend. Okay, so there are a couple of counter arguments you can make. The first one being there's a downward trend in the amount of legislation that's being passed. Okay, so there's a piece of evidence here that talks about, that we get a graph of the amount of legislation that's been passed since 1900 all the way up to 2019, and you can see that in the UK Parliament there's been a very slow, steady decline in the amount of legislation that has been passed since the early 1900s. So obviously the argument being that Parliament, doesn't necessarily pass as much legislation as it used to. So this function of Parliament, that it's supposed to pass legislation, would be, you could argue against that. You could also argue You could also argue that the legislative process is somewhat biased in the first place. Okay, it's biased in the favour of the government of the day. So the government has a majority in Parliament, often has a majority in Parliament if they're a majority government, and so therefore this majority government will effectively dictate the amount of legislation that is passed. Okay, so the passing of legislation is biased in favour of the government of the day when they have a clear majority, and we have a clear majority here in the current Conservative government. And one of the points you can make is there are clearly unpopular legislation that's probably going to get voted down by almost all of the opposition that the government is trying to push through. And obviously the most prominent piece of legislation I can think of when we're talking about legislation that's probably not going to get much support from the other side of Parliament is the new crime and policing bill that is going through Parliament right now. The crime and policing bill, arguably something that is very controversial at the moment, okay, using the kind of emergency powers granted from the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, and this passing of legislation is very controversial. Now, whether or not you agree with the legislation is irrelevant to this question. The question is asking us whether or not the functions of both houses of Parliament are really fulfilled. And so you can make the argument that legislation is biased in favour of the government of the day. It says there, government of the dad, I've just noticed. Let's just, hang on, let me just change that there. There we go. The government of the dad. Right. Anyway, back to it. Government of the day. And so, yeah, you could make the argument that controversial legislation, which regardless of what you think about the police and crime bill that is being passed through Parliament at the moment, we can all agree that it's relatively controversial. So that's one of the points that we can make here. Can anybody tell me a further point when it comes to another function of Parliament? So any other functions of Parliament that we can think about, whilst I just get up a couple of other points here. Okay. So, can anybody think of any other functions of Parliament? Whilst I get up some more information for us all to look at. Okay. Doo-dum, doo-doo-dum. No one can think of any of the functions of Parliament? Well, we can talk about the next function of Parliament, which would be to scrutinise and hold government to account. This would be a second function of Parliament. Don't forget, in this country we have a system of separation of powers, whereby we have the separation between the Parliament and government, even though they're technically, they sit in the same institution. So we have a kind of a weird system that's obviously developed over a very long time. So the question is, to what extent does Parliament hold and scrutinise the government, hold government to account? Well, you could talk about the fact that this happens a lot during parliamentary question times. Okay, so pretty much every single day a certain department will get questions from the opposition and from their own party as well, and they will be scrutinised on the actions that they take, on the policies that they're implementing. So you could argue that this is a very a successful performance of Parliament's functions, because it's able to scrutinise using parliamentary questions, and obviously question time for the Prime Minister is probably the most most highly publicised part. AK Tech, hello to you too. Yeah, it's probably the most publicised type of question time, parliamentary, Prime Minister's questions on Wednesdays. So you could argue that that is a very good way in which Parliament scrutinises the actions of government, and that is obviously one of the functions of Parliament. You could also talk about the fact that Parliament scrutinises the government through committees. So Parliament scrutinising the government using the committee system. I've got a video on the committee system if anybody wants to, to brief themselves on that. So these are all important ways in which the Houses of Parliament are able to scrutinise the government in best way they can. Can anybody argue why a counterpoint to that? Can anybody think of a counterpoint to what I've just mentioned? The fact that Parliament is sometimes, that Parliament's function is to scrutinise the government, and it does so using question times and committees, etc., etc. There are a couple of points you could bring up. Can anybody think of anything that we could talk about? If not, I've got some points over here. Okay, so you could make the argument in an essay that while Parliament does perform the function of committees, scrutinising through committees, scrutinising through parliamentary questions, you could make the point that, for on the one hand, question time, parliamentary questions, are more of a kind of are more of a show. They're more of a performance rather than any kind of actual scrutinising, and you can see that by watching Wednesday's PMQs. You can see that the point isn't necessarily to really scrutinise the Prime Minister and get a good dialogue between the two sides. The point is to create sound bites and try to trap the Prime Minister, and then the Prime Minister does the backhand tries to trap members who are asking him questions, and so it becomes more of a I'm going to try and pronounce my words today. It becomes more of a charade, more of a performance, more of a staged thing, rather than any kind of actual policy scrutinising. And you can also make the argument that committees are often just ignored by the government, and there are points that we can look at here. So this one here is an article where the government is accused of ignoring select committee recommendations in final Heathrow expansion policy. And again, this is an example of the government being accused of just blatantly ignoring the kind of scrutiny that is done in these committee meetings. So these are the kind of things you can talk about. Okay, so you could really ask the question: to what extent does the government really get held to account using these two methods? And then to what extent, if it is the case that they are getting held to account, to what extent does the government even listen or even care about the fact that they're recommending something and something else? They've got the votes to do whatever they want. That's the argument there. A third point is that Parliament has a function of being a recruiting ground for the executive branch. So the executive branch of government recruits almost entirely, actually completely entirely, from Parliament. They are MPs that, or peers, used to be peers, that would come and be raised to the executive branch, will be elected to the cabinet, and chosen by the Prime Minister to sit in cabinet. So really, to be a member of the government, you must be a person who is also a member of the legislature. So you have to be elected or appointed as a peer in the legislature in Parliament. So a function of Parliament is to provide this kind of ground for the executive to recruit members of Parliament, and that is the argument that we could make here. Now, obviously, there are counterpoints to this. People argue that rather than this being a benefit, to the system, it can actually be seen as a restraint on the ability of Parliament to scrutinise and to hold, for its functions, because with only the pool of recruitment coming from the structure of it's limited in its talent. So there's a limitation in the amount of talent that is represented within government. If every single member of the executive is just an MP or a peer, then there's there's a slight limitation on as to the amount to which the amount of diversity of talent there can be within the system. Okay, so these are the points that we can look at. These are some interesting points we can look at. So if we're going to structure this essay, in a way that is favourable, you could argue. I think it would be very difficult to argue that Parliament completely fails in the carrying out of its main functions. I think that's a very difficult one to argue. It'd be difficult to argue that Parliament will fail to carry out its functions entirely, because there are obviously back and forths on either side when we're looking at this question. Okay. So the first thing you should always do when you have a question like this is to identify the functions of Parliament that we can talk about. Now, there are other functions of Parliament that we can talk about. Okay, you could talk about the fact that Parliament is a representation of the people, and so that's obviously a very important one. The people elect parliamentary MPs, and so that is one that can be seen as a function of Parliament, to represent the people. And obviously, you can think of the points that we've made in this presentation here. So we can think of the functions of Parliament, identifying them, and then ask ourselves to what extent they actually do those functions well. Okay, I'm just going to recap for everybody what we're going to do, how we could structure this question. Just very quickly recap. So there are a number of functions that you can do when it comes to the comes to the functions of Parliament. There are a number of functions that we can highlight. One of them being the passage of legislation. I talked about there being, legislation being passed, and then you can counter that point by saying there's been a downward trend in the amount of legislation that's being passed. And I've linked some statistics in the chat. And you could also talk about the fact that legislation is generally biased in favour of the government of the day, because they have a clear majority, so they have control over the agenda. A second point we could talk about is the fact that they scrutinise and hold government to account. Again, this is done through the question times, parliamentary questions, and also through the committee systems. And then you can counter that point by saying, well, to what extent does that actually happen? To what extent does the government really get held to account by Parliament? And then, if so, to what extent does the government actually listen? And I linked an article about the fact that a committee recommended the government, the government was accused of ignoring a select committee recommendations when it came to the expansion of Heathrow. So these are all points we can talk about. And then obviously we've got the fact that Parliament is a sole recruiting ground. I personally probably wouldn't actually like to use this point for an essay. I'd rather talk about the fact that you've got the fact that Parliament represents the people. That's probably a more solid argument that you can make. The fact that Parliament represents people. Hello to you too. We're just recapping this first question before we look at the probably one of my favourite questions that I've done so far, of like the 10 or 11 questions that we've looked at. So Parliament can be seen as a sole recruiting ground for the executive branch, but then you could go into a discussion about, is this really a benefit to Parliament, or is this really a restraint? So just a quick question from last week's stream regarding, do UK judges have power to only have quasi-legislative powers? Is the question, do judges have legislative powers or even quasi-legislative powers? Because if that's the question, then the answer would be pretty much a resounding no. When it comes to the passing of legislation, when it comes to legislative powers, that power is vested almost solely in Parliament. Because obviously we have the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. Parliament is sovereign to make and unmake any law it so chooses. Okay, the Human Rights Act is just do they have quasi-legislative powers? Yeah, no, they don't have any powers to make any law, any legislation whatsoever. What the Human Rights Act does... oh, no, the messages don't get delayed. There's a delay on the latency, don't worry. So, what the Human Rights Act does... I thought I would just recap the Human Rights Act really quickly. What the Human Rights Act does is it basically incorporates most of the provisions from the European Convention of Human Rights into UK law. The Human Rights Act is just an act of Parliament like any other act of Parliament. Okay, there's no special legislative power that the Human Rights Act has, because it's not like the United States where they have a codified constitution and then they have this entrenched legislation. We just have a piece of legislation that could be repealed tomorrow if the government had the votes to do so. And this actually does bring us into the question when we're talking about the new policing and crime bill, because the policing and crime bill does place restrictions on the ability for peaceful protests, and obviously that is incompatible with the Human Rights Act's protection of peaceful protest, the protection of protesting and and the freedom of assembly and expression. Now, what would happen in this case, in this example, is if it was shown that this piece of legislation, the police and crime bill that's going to be passed soon, I assume, okay, if that piece of legislation was shown to be in violation of the Human Rights Act, what the courts will do is issue what we call a declaration of incompatibility, to declare that it is incompatible with the Human Rights Act. Now, at that point, the government can either change the parts of the bill or repeal the bill, or they could just repeal the Human Rights Act, because Parliament can do effectively what it wants if it has the votes. The Human Rights Act and the Constitution gets a bit confusing for me at times, but I've explained it previously. Yeah, well, this is the point. The Constitution and constitutional law in the United Kingdom is ridiculously complicated, because it comes from thousands of years of development. Okay, you can trace bits of constitutional law all the way back to the Roman periods in Roman law, and it has developed for over thousands of years. So I can understand why it'd be very confusing, because it is, and there are a lot of unanswered questions when it comes to constitutional law that we prefer not to talk about. These kind of questions. If anybody has any other questions relating to not just these exam questions we're looking at here, but anything in general, just don't hesitate to let me know. Right, let's have a look at the second question. The second question being probably my favourite that I've done so far. Is the current Labour Party influenced more by old Labour than by new Labour? So judges only have the power to deem if legislation passed in Parliament is compatible and incompatible with regards to Human Rights Act. Yeah, effectively, when you have a piece of legislation, when you have a piece of legislation that is incompatible with the Human Rights Act, judges can have the power to issue a declaration of incompatibility. Now, the government has always followed this kind of declaration of incompatibility whenever the Supreme Court has said that this rule or this law is incompatible. Don't be fooled into thinking that this police and crime bill is the first time a government has tried to break its own rules when it comes to the Human Rights Act. Following 9/11 and a number of terrorism pieces of terrorism legislation, there have been going back and forth all the time on whether or not certain rules and provisions are in breach of the Human Rights Act. If anybody has ever watched, I believe it's on YouTube, if anybody has ever watched, it's a documentary made by the BBC about the Supreme Court, they dedicate an entire section to the back and forth that they had when it came to stay-at-home orders for suspected terrorists, and the Supreme Court basically said every single time these are a violation of the Human Rights Act, and the Labour government at the time always backed out, always backed down. Let me just link it. It's a very interesting documentary anyway. Supreme Court documentary. Let's have a look before we look at this. If anybody's got any points to make about this Labour question, feel free to put them in the chat, because it's good. It's very fun. It's a very fun question to look at. So this is the documentary. If anybody wants to watch that, but yeah, there are countless cases of the government conceding to the. The Blair government completely ignored it. Well, the Blair government didn't completely ignore it, really. What happened is the Supreme Court argued. So at first, the government suggested that they would be suspected terrorists would have stay-at-home orders of more than 24 hours, of up to 24 hours or 18 hours a day or whatever, and the Supreme Court ruled that was incompatible with the Human Rights Act, and it went back and forth and back and forth. On the most part, for most of the time, the government tends to back down when it comes to being accused of human rights violations, because don't forget there is a difference between what is legally allowed when it comes to parliamentary sovereignty, what Parliament's legal sovereignty is, which is to do whatever it wants. But then there's a difference between the legal sovereignty and its political sovereignty, because Parliament might be able to legally repeal the Human Rights Act, but for the most part that would be seen as political suicide, so it would be difficult to do. Yes, they were miles away from home on an 18-hour lockdown. Basically, yeah. Okay, let's move on to the second question. So, is the current Labour Party influenced more by old Labour than by new Labour? I've said that this is quite a difficult question, but it's only difficult if you haven't studied or if you haven't, you don't know enough about the Labour Party in the first place. So it should be noted, I think anyone who wants to answer this kind of question, they should note that the current Labour Party is really a product of both old Labour and new Labour principles and people. There is a mix between the two. Okay, there is a mix between the two. And so it's important that we recognise that the Labour Party right now is neither old Labour or new Labour. There's actually a conflict that's going on right now, and it has been going on for the last, ever since Starmer was elected leader. New Labour because they got rid of clause. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. We will be getting onto this. Clause 4, yeah. I was wondering what you were thinking, which clause we were talking about then. So, which one is the most influential at the moment? Okay, that's the question, and we can really link this, and we can really break this up by looking at the, the different leaders, of each party. Okay, of each era of Labour almost. So we can generally try to define New Labour as something that took place in a period, beginning with the product of Blair's victory in 1997, and going all the way through. Really, leaders like Blair, Brown and Starmer undoubtedly would be linked to the views of New Labour, with the idea of New Labour. So we have Tony Blair being elected in 1997, the largest majority in history. Okay, he goes on for a few years, for a couple more elections. Brown takes over, as we know, just at the sort of the head of the financial crisis. And then in 2010, we have the election which led to a hung parliament, and we have Cameron and Clegg forming the Tory Lib Dem coalition. And during this time, Labour elects Ed Miliband, who can be really just seen as part of the old Labour tradition. And the old Labour tradition, as we know, seeks to connect the party with its roots. It includes things like traditional Labour policies, such as nationalisation, redistribution of wealth and income and stuff like that. And generally anti-war, these kind of things, anti-foreign intervention, the kind of pro-working class, very pro-unions. All of these things can be linked to old Labour compared to new Labour. Okay. Now, obviously, we can sort of group the two groups. We can group the leaders of each group into the two camps. So you've got Blair, Brown, and Starmer, who are undoubtedly New Labour, or undoubtedly influenced more by New Labour, and then you've got leaders like Corbyn and to an extent Miliband. Okay, mainly Corbyn, but to an extent Miliband, that are linked with the old Labour traditions. Now, if anybody remembers, I don't know if anybody remembers back when Ed Miliband was Labour leader before 2015, people used to call him Red Ed, and he had I believe his dad was a socialist sociologist professor at a university. So that's why we've got to link these together. But definitely, when we're talking about old Labour, definitely Corbyn. So speaking of Corbyn, is the current Labour Party more new or more old? What kind of evidence can we think about for that? What kind of evidence have we got? So let me do a couple of things actually. Is the current Labour Party influenced? So hang on, let me just do a couple of things. Is the current Labour Party influenced more by old Labour than by new Labour? Okay, I'm just putting the link in the I'm putting the question in chat and then pinning it so that people can see what the question is. Okay, New Labour as Starmer is a moderate. Well, yeah, that's the first point. New broadband policies. You could argue that the broadband policies were a tradition of old Labour. They're new in terms of being technologically new, but what Corbyn was trying to do in the 2019 manifesto was effectively nationalise broadband, and that is something that goes back to an old Labour tradition. So there's obviously an undoubted desire for old Labour policies. We can see this old Labour policies when we look at the fact that Jeremy Corbyn won election in 2015, won an election for the Labour leadership in 2015, but then also won re-election when when people tried to oust him again. So we can see that within the Labour Party there is definitely a desire for old Labour, and Corbyn's influence on the Labour Party isn't something that's going to go away for a very long time. There are still a lot of Labour Corbynite MPs that are in the backbenches of the Labour Party, definitely shouting and screaming all the time. Now, obviously, we could also talk about the fact that old Labour can be the return of old Labour almost can be seen through the election of Ed Miliband. So Ed Miliband isn't as traditional Labour as Corbyn might be. You could make that claim, but it sort of shows the sort of winds of change as Labour was becoming to take more of the old traditional viewpoint. Okay, so therefore, a Miliband being more old Labour than new Labour shows signs that the Labour Party was beginning to shift. Okay, from 2010 all the way up to 2015. Then we have Corbyn from 2015 to 2019, or just the end of 2020, start of 2020. Sorry. So from the period between 2015 and 2019, this was one of solid old Labour traditions. Okay, while there was conflict within the party between old and new Labour, okay, with people trying to oust him, every single time they tried to basically get rid of Corbyn, tried to get him out, he would win these elections with a large majority. So definitely in this period of time there is a taste for old Labour. However, obviously we can't be talking about Corbyn for this time because Corbyn hasn't been leader since last year until for nearly over a year at this point. Okay, and so we have to talk about the influence of Keir Starmer. let's just make a little question here. So, so what is the influence of Keir Starmer? Now, of course, Keir Starmer, for a start, was somebody who was in the shadow cabinet of Jeremy Corbyn's. So he was definitely, you know, willing to participate and engage with old Labour. That's something that is, quite clearly the case. However, we could all definitely argue that Starmer is of the new Labour politics, more of the kind of centrist Labour ideas rather than the left of the party. More old, he was accused of being anti-Semite. So Corbyn was more old. Undoubtedly, Corbyn represented the older generation of the Labour Party, the traditional workers' rights, nationalisation, union building, all of these different things. These are things that are obviously, to some extent, are still present within New Labour, but nowhere near to the kind of extent that we would see with Corbyn. Accused of being anti-Semitic, yes, of course. But all he has done is advocating for the rights of the Palestinian people. Starmer, on the other hand, if he's PM, will turn a blind eye. Well, that's a point of political a political question that you can discuss, definitely. So there's no doubt that Starmer has brought Labour Party more towards New Labour since his election in 2020. So we don't just have to talk about the fact that we have these different leaders that have these different ideas that have been elected in these different ways. Okay, I'm just get up some information about the 2020 Labour leadership election, just because I want to see just by how much did Keir Starmer win. So, as we can see here, Keir Starmer won the 2020 Labour leadership election by 56.2%. Okay, the person who came second, who was Rebecca Long-Bailey, who was more of the traditional old Labour Corbynite policies, came second with 27.6%, and then Lisa Nandy 16.2%. So you can see that Starmer has a very popular party. Okay, so Starmer won in a landslide. So Starmer won in a landslide in this period of time. So there's undoubtedly a surge for Labour politics, for New Labour politics. We could then talk about Starmer's actions. Okay, so his election to leader of the Labour Party has sparked a war in the Labour Party between the New Labour moderates and the more left-wing side of the party, with Corbyn and Rebecca Long-Bailey and the likes of these individuals. Okay, so what can we talk about in reference to anti-Semitism? Because there's no doubt that anti-Semitism played a part in Starmer's decisions when it comes to his attacks on the Labour left. They want a new Tony Blair. Basically, Starmer is trying to represent this kind of new reformed Tony Blair-esque style New Labour politics. So there's undoubtedly the case that right now there is the influence of New Labour quite heavily in the party. But what can we talk about if we're making a reference to the claims of anti-Semitism and the IHRA report? The IHRA report. Let me find it. So we've got the politics. Sorry, the politics. So of course, the politics of Keir Starmer is very much New Labour, and we can see that Starmer, whilst he initially said that he wanted to try and unite the party together and sort of bring the Corbynite MPs into the tent, when he appointed people like Rebecca Long Bailey to the cabinet, he very, very quickly effectively used any kind of excuse to try and get rid of them. So a very good example is Rebecca Long Bailey being suspended and kicked out of the cabinet for her relationship with somebody who, I believe it was a tweet. Hang on. Rebecca Long, if I can spell. Effectively, she shared an article, an interview by an actor, and this actor made a number of accusations against Israel, and some of them being false when it comes to the training of police in the United States, and so Keir Starmer kicked her out. That's what we got when we got rid of Rebecca Long Bailey, who's clearly an old Labour Corbynite member of the party, and then we also obviously have the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn himself. Okay, so the report from the IHRA when it comes to anti-Semitism within the party was released. At the same time, Jeremy Corbyn did an interview where he said that he disagrees with some aspects of the report, and Keir Starmer immediately suspended Jeremy Corbyn from the party. So obviously we can see that Keir Starmer's hostilities towards the old Labour politics is clear. We can see that it's clear. So I'm just linking a number of different points here because there was so much drama going on between the two, between old and new Labour, that it's sometimes difficult to catch up. So, is there any other points anybody would like to make reference to? Is there any other points people would like to talk about? Or maybe even any other questions anybody would like to bring up in general, for politics in general. That isn't fair. You can dislike the state of Israel and not be anti-Semitic. Yeah, of course. You can, of course, do that. Now, the kind of nuance behind this kind of anti-Semitism fiasco within the Labour Party is very difficult. You have to remember that what Starmer wants to do is, because anti-Semitism was a very big issue when it came to the 2019 general election. Starmer wants to stamp out any examples or any kind of anti-Semitism wherever he may find it. And so therefore, if you've got a former leader of the party saying, disagreeing with an IHRA report talking about anti-Semitism, then regardless of whether or not it's fair, Starmer was always going to suspend him and sort of crack the whip very hard against Corbyn for that. What would you recommend as best sites, etc., as sources for politics news? Well, there are plenty of sources for politics news that we can look at. The first place you can look when it comes to sources for political news is obviously the BBC. Now, regardless of what people on the left and people on the right say, the BBC is really not as biased as people like to make out. It's really silly. Also, I'd always recommend this YouTube channel that has grown significantly since I last checked on it, which is TLDR News. I hope I get a plug for that. So we've got TLDR News. TLDR News goes over a number of different interesting things in quite nice animated videos. There's a huge amount of channels they've got. They've got TLDR News US, TLDR News EU. They've got their own podcast, TLDR Daily, and they've got TLDR Global News. So you can really get a full grasp of politics just from that as well. TLDR News is great. Yeah, exactly. TLDR News is brilliant for political news. Are there any other questions relating to this particular exam question or just politics in general. Any other questions related to this exam question or politics in general, I'm happy to stay for a good 10-15 minutes and just go through and answer whatever questions anybody has. I do realise also that these streams have been quite quick. Normally I try and make them an hour long, so I might actually add another exam question in there. So we do 3. I think next week as well we're gonna move away from UK politics and maybe start looking at some comparative politics or also political ideas. I'm consciously aware that I haven't covered enough political ideas yet, so I think some political ideas questions would also be very useful. The third way Labour. Let me just generally speaking, when we talk about the third way in terms of politics, in terms of liberalism, the third way is a political position that seeks to try and bring everybody together. It seeks to try and bring the left and the right together and advocates for a kind of centre-right economic platforms, by the looks of it, what I'm reading, with some centre-left social policies. So what we would talk about when we talk about the third way is whenever we're doing political ideas and political philosophy, you have to kind of separate economic politics, your economic views, from your social views. Now, somebody can be economically right-wing and socially left-wing. We can see that kind of thing can happen. Now, if you're economically right-wing, you would talk about things like free markets, the removal of regulations on the market and all this kind of thing, like the free market libertarianism. And then obviously, as you go further left, the more you can talk about the kind of political the things like nationalisation and more regulation on economic markets and stuff like that. And if you go further and further left, you start to begin to critique capitalism as a whole, and then start to advocate for more socialist ideas, whether that be things like social democracy, which is a kind of capitalism but with with regulations, etc., or just go full on socialism, communism, anarcho-communism, anarcho-syndicalism, all these different things. Okay, third way is neoliberalism, which is basically just conservatism going back to classical liberal ideas. Yeah, effectively, neoliberalism, the concept of neoliberalism. Let me link a thing for neoliberalism. Effectively, classical liberals these days would align more with conservatives than they would with any kind of liberal democrat, for example. So neoliberalism has had a number of different terms, but in today's world, we talk about neoliberalism as being almost akin to the kind of libertarian thinking, the kind of Robert Nozick philosophies. So very free markets, freedom of ideas. But that doesn't tend to spill over into the social, because on social issues, you can be very left-wing whilst at the same time advocating for free markets and stuff like that, and private property, etc., etc. Would you be able to go over scrutiny of the executive? Absolutely. Absolutely. If anybody wants me to also, instead of just doing exam questions, if anybody would want me to also just go through and do normal lessons, that would also be fine for me as well. I don't mind talking about that. Scrutiny of the executive. Are there any more questions anybody else wants to ask? Any other questions? I've just in reading politics, we've just had a breaking news. Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon cleared of breaching the ministerial code over an investigation into complaints against Alex Salmond. So, if anyone wants to, the most cutting-edge politics on this channel, we have Nicola Sturgeon cleared of charges. If we get the... where is it? Where is it? I'm just trying to find the actual... There we go. Did not breach the ministerial code. Nicola Sturgeon did not breach the ministerial code. Now, obviously, the convention is that if a politician breaches the ministerial code within the executive, they have to... The general convention is that they resign. And now we know what a convention is. You know, generally the rule is that they resign. However, this convention has been breached quite a lot, especially recently when it comes to Priti Patel's bullying accusations, definitely breaching the ministerial code, but just deciding not to resign anyway. Because technically, legally speaking, it is it is the Prime Minister that calls for ministers to resign if they refuse to, and obviously they backed Patel. SNP are having infighting. They're having a lot of infighting, that's true. We've got a lot of problems going on with the SNP at the moment. However, at the moment, she seems to have been cleared of any charges when it comes to breaching the ministerial code, which I'm sure is good for her. So, could I define modern liberalism? Modern liberalism, well, it depends on what we mean. It's hard to define liberalism in general, really. Modern liberalism is really the kind of... it combines the kind of ideas of social justice. It tends to be less free market than traditional liberalism, because obviously traditional classical liberalism is linked very heavily with the ideas of people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, for example, and traditional that they're the kind of traditional free market ideas. Modern liberalism advocates for what's known as a mixed economy. Now, pretty much every economy in the world is a mixed economy. This is where you have a mixture between privatization, private industry, and private ownership of the means of production, as well as nationalization, which is the kind of public ownership of the kind of means of production and exchange. So, for example, the United Kingdom is a mixed economy. It has a number of industries and a number of sectors that are private. There are private businesses and private institutions, but it also has a number of public institutions. Things like the NHS is a very big nationalised industry. So modern liberals advocate for the kind of mixed economy. They advocate for the kind of social justice, the kind of, on a social level, things like social justice, equality of education, quality of opportunity, women's rights, LGBT rights, racial justice, all these kinds of things. That's how you can define modern liberalism compared to classical liberalism, of course. Any more questions before we finish? It should be noted, also that that modern liberalism is sort of a reaction against free market ideas and the free market capitalism that we have in classical liberalism. If there are no more questions, then I'm happy to finish up. For anybody who's studying A-level history, we're doing a history stream tomorrow at the same time at 4 o'clock. We're going to be covering the Tudors. We're going to be doing Tudors. People voted on whether or not we should do Tudors or Russia, and the people voted for Tudors. I mean, Rawls's idea and those who were inspired by him. Well, Rawls's political philosophy is probably a bit more for the to the scope of the next couple of minutes for me to explain it. But Rawls's philosophy is very, very complicated. It comes from the idea of there being a veil of ignorance, the idea of people being behind this veil of ignorance in an original position, and asking the question, how would you view society? How would you want to view society if you were in this veil of ignorance where you don't know whereabouts you would fit and sit in the kind of social class system? I will be covering Rawls's political philosophy and Rawls's liberal ideas in a video very, very soon. We're going through liberalism at the moment, doing a video a week, and we will get to Rawls very, very shortly. So probably next week or the week after, we'll be talking about Rawls. So if you want to just hold on for that video, because there's a lot more to it than what I've just managed to explain. Anyway, thank you to everybody that's turned up. Thank you for everybody that's turned up. Any more questions, leave them in the chat and I'll reply to them on text. And I'll see everybody who's doing history tomorrow for the stream for the Tudors A-level history. So thank you very much, and I will see you all next week.